All right, so backward course design. Do you know what backward course design is? Can you tell me what backward course design is?
Yes, you start at the very end of the things that you want all of your students to be able to achieve and to do, and then you work backwards to hit those points.
Brilliant. You want to do this presentation for me? That would be great. So backward course design is to begin with the end. So what you do is you say, what do I want my students to take away from this course? And how do I want them to be changed from my course? So usually when we're developing courses, we think, well, I know I'm going to do this assignment. I know I'm going to teach this lecture. But when you're working with your students, you want to think, how am I going to impact their future? How am I going to impact their careers? And how are they going to actually learn this material? So that's some of what backward course design focuses on. And this is a quote by Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It says, to begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means to know where you're going so that you better understand where you are not, so that the steps you take are always in the right direction. So if you're always thinking about, how am I going to impact my students? How am I going to change them? How am I going to make their career better? Everything you're doing in your course is going to be a reflection of that. So you're not going to have assignments that students go, why am I doing this assignment? Why am I doing this lecture? Or why am I listening to this lecture that has no impact on anything I'm ever going to do again? So it makes it a clearer and more concise course. It makes it easier for your students to follow, and it makes it so that you have a clear understanding of what you want to do, so you're not wasting your own time. So this is just a little bit about the framework. I always say any framework that considers your students and puts the students first is a phenomenal framework. And that's because we're here for our learners. We're here to engage them, we're here to retain them, and we're here to make sure that they're actually going to develop skills needed for job placement. So for me, my background's educational technology. So we'll talk about some scenarios as we go through, and I'll say how I would develop a course using backward course design as well. But this framework isn't just limited to online courses. It can be utilized for face-to-face, it can be utilized for hybrid, you can do asynchronous, synchronous. It's a very universal framework. And it was developed in 1998 by I'm going to butcher his name, McTighe and Grant Wiggins. So, what are the questions you should be asking when you're utilizing this framework? First, what should students walk out the door able to understand, regardless of what learning activities you use? So you should not be considering activities, tests, assignments, anything like that at this point. You just want to know what is the fundamental knowledge your students need to have when they're leaving your course. What is the evidence of such ability? So how are you going to make sure that they're getting that knowledge? And what texts, activities, and methods will best enable such a result? So these are the steps to consider when going through with these. There's 3 steps, 3 questions. They're very similar, but they work together, and as we go, you'll see how those questions are always considered throughout these steps. First, identifying the desired results. What are my students going to understand? What are they going to know at the end of the course? Determining what will be acceptable evidence. So this isn't just what kind of assignments, it's how am I going to make sure this evidence is acceptable for what they're understanding at the end of the course. And planning learning experiences and instructions. So step 1, identify the desired results. This is when we're going to focus on the question, what should students walk out of the door able to understand, regardless of what activities are used? So I'm developing a course on accessibility and usability. I know I want my students to be able to, 1, understand what accessibility is and how to implement it. I want them to be able to demonstrate that. I want them to be able to make a PDF, Word document, PowerPoint accessible. I want them to be able to share this knowledge with others confidently. So how am I going to get there? Say Meredith and I were having a conversation, we're like, we could work on these technologies and get them to look at this, I could talk about this, but I need to first realize, are these going to reflect what I want them to walk out the door with? Because if they aren't, I'm too far ahead of myself. I got to take a step back and say, this is the knowledge that they need to get. How can I develop these activities around this knowledge? So with PowerPoints, I always put a bunch of information on here. I'm not going to read all this, but if you want to look at it, you're more than welcome. I always like to say, I always go back to Bloom's taxonomy. You always want your students to understand. You want them to have knowledge. You want them to use all of those action verbs or knowledge verbs that say, I know what I'm doing and I can create this, I can explore this, so those are what you should be thinking about in step 1. And you should also say, are there any theories I want to focus on? Is there any concepts I want to remember? And is there anything I want them to be able to take to a job, interview, something that is actually going to be utilized in practice for their career? So this is where you're at for step 1. It's very general, but it's probably the most impactful step, because this is where you're starting, but this is where your students are ending. So you have to think, what is best for them at this step? And how can I get that acceptable evidence to show that they have learned what I want them to learn? So the question, what is evidence of such ability? This is where you could start thinking about those assignments. So say I'm developing my course on accessibility and usability. I'm going to have them do research. I'm going to have them look into some technologies that can be utilized for accessibility. I'm going to have them probably write a paper on the importance of accessibility and usability. I'm going to have them examine other students in the course and work together in a collaborative setting to develop these skill sets. So these are some of the things I would do for them to have that knowledge and understanding at the end of the course. And then you want to make sure that the instructor is focused on the learning outcomes here, because what is going to happen is this is where you start to think, what are my learning objectives? How am I going to make sure that these learning objectives and outcomes are actually being applied to my course, and that my students are doing activities, assignments that are reflective of that. And also at this point, you want to consider a range of assessment models. I know usually when we start talking about any kind of assessment, usually tests, quizzes, discussions, especially for an online course, are primarily what people go to. Face-to-face, very similar. You might have some more group work because it's easier to utilize that in a face-to-face setting. But there's so many new assessment models out there and different ways that we can actually gauge knowledge beyond a standardized test, a quiz, that actually are a better reflection on students' knowledge. Because as we know, multiple studies have said not all students are great standardized test takers. And it's not always an accurate reflection of knowledge. Doesn't mean we shouldn't utilize them, but we need to explore different ways. Projects, great, because it's so versatile. There's so many different things you can do. So when you're at this step, try to go out of what you would think of a standard box. And also consider your final assessment at this point, because your final assessment is going to be the biggest reflection and evidence of their ability and knowledge in the course. So are you going to do a final exam? Is that just your only final project assessment of this knowledge? Maybe you should explore doing a final exam and a project together so that you split that so they're not just focused on a standardized test. But this will give you the idea to make sure that you're actually addressing what you claimed in step 1. So you would have to explore, how do I know they have this knowledge? And how can I get them to show me they have this knowledge in a way that isn't just a standardized test? And it could be a standardized test depending on what the course is, but I always like to encourage people to think outside of the box with these things. Now you're going to go on to step 3. This is planning, learning, experience, and instructions. This is where you get a little bit more detailed with your assignments. You flesh out your rubrics, you get everything ready, and you think what texts, activities, and methods will be best to enable such a result. So you start thinking about, what textbook am I going to use? What am I going to have them read in the textbook? That gets to that final part. Do I need them to read the whole textbook? Do I need them to just look at chapter 5 and 6? So those are some things to explore. Do I want to use supplemental material like PDFs? Do I want to have, if you're a face-to-face course, what do I want to lecture about? What do I want to have while I'm lecturing? What displays do I want to use? Things like that get the learning activities more engaged, and students will usually retain more knowledge from lectures than most other materials. So when we're talking online courses, it's so important to have some form of instructor presence to where they're hearing from you directly. A lot of the time I think we get hooked up on, well, this textbook provides me with this instructional, and I'm just going to use this. But here, when we're looking at this, we're going to think, well, what will be the best method to enable such a result? So you're thinking back to step one. What do I want my students to walk away with, and how am I going to make sure they have that knowledge? So the instructor has to have some form of presence and involvement in that course, especially with online courses, because it's so impactful for a student to hear from a faculty member. They're not going to meet in person. But if they can see you or even just hear you, it's going to make a big adjustment for them. So I always encourage some kind of lecture. You could be a voice over a PowerPoint, you can go into a Prezi, you can do something even more engaging, but having that involvement is so impactful for the students. Also, your sequence. How are you going to teach the material that you know you want to do? What sequence are you going to go in? So, accessibility and usability. Am I going to have them start with a PDF? Probably not. I'm probably going to start with reviewing what is accessibility and usability. I'm not going to have them go in converting stuff and making it 100% accessible. I'm going to go over the foundation. I'm going to go into what is accessibility, do some basic definitions, some core research. Then I'm going to go into, here's some tools we can use to make documents accessible. So your structure and sequence is going to be super important when using backward course design, because now you know what activities you're going to do, what learning assessments you're going to do, and what your learning outcome is going to be. What do you want your students to walk away with? So with that, besides, I think that's pretty much with this one. I'm looking to make sure I'm not missing anything. I think we're good. I'm out of breath too. So this is what I love to consider when you're at the end of a course, or when you're, say you've used backward course design, you went through step 1 and 3, and now you're thinking, what do I do next? Well, with any framework, evaluation is key. You can't just develop a course, go through and say, I'm ready to send it to my students. It's always best to look back over it, because we're human, we all make mistakes, we all have things that maybe aren't as clear as we want them to be. So I always like to use where to. This can be used all throughout or at the very end, because it says, where to am I going? So the W stands for where's the unit going and what is expected. So this means what is expected of students and what knowledge they hope to achieve is clear. So this, you look through your stuff, is everything clear, concise? Are my students going to understand it the way that I understand it? And if not, how can I make that more impactful for them? What can I change? What can I implement to make sure that it's clear for them? Is it holding students' interest? For face-to-face courses, that means, is my lecture engaging? Are students being responsive to what I'm putting out there? If everybody's looking at their phone, sleeping, what can I do to make them more engaged in the learning activity and retaining the knowledge? We don't want students looking at the clock being like, is it time to go? We want them to be engaged in the learning process. Online courses, how do you hold a student's interest? You don't have that same kind of connection with them to where you can see they're doing. So visually, you want it to be engaging. You want to make sure whatever you're saying, if you're doing a lecture, sounds engaging. You want to make sure that you're putting that extra effort in tone. You want to make sure you're doing the extra effort in visuals, just to make sure that the overall course itself is engaging and holds the student's interest. So first E, explore, experience, enable, and equip. So evaluate your activities and assignments from an early planning phase to ensure lecture content aligns. This is so key, because sometimes when we're going on lectures, we'll get sidetracked. We'll start talking about things that really interest us, and we get away from what we want the students to learn. Or a student question's so great, engaging, we start to go off on another topic. So we always have to make sure that whatever we do, we have a way to get back on track. So that's what this phase is for. R, reflect, rethink, and revise. I always think reflecting on what you've done is key, because I've changed this PowerPoint so many times, I've changed this lecture so many times, because you can always make anything better. So always think about, what can I do to make it more engaging for my learner? What can I do to reflect these, to revise these things, and even get an extra set of eyes on it. If you're doing an online course, say, hey, come through and look at this and tell me what you think. I just want to know, what do you think I could change? Is it clear? Are students going to have the same understanding that we have? And it's always great to do that. Evaluate your work in progress. Allow students to self-evaluate and reflect on progress, especially if you're doing a course for the first iteration it's always great to get that student feedback. I know for us at USC Aiken, sometimes we focus on those teacher evaluations at the end of the course. I would try to do something in your course itself where you're getting your students to do a self-reflection and reflect on the course as well. So say, what did I learn? What am I getting out of this course? What would I change about this course? And what did I really enjoy about this course? So you don't want to just focus on the negative, and sometimes with those student evaluations, since not everyone does them, you hear the best voices and the most dissatisfied voices, but you want to make sure you have a full range of everything, likes, dislikes, and that's a good way to do that. Tailor and personalize the work. I think this is key. Not all students learn the exact same way. So you're going to have some students who really struggle with some of the assignments, and they come to you and say, I just can't get the material this way. I'm more of a visual learner, I'm more of somebody who can talk it out, but with writing, I'm just really struggling. So see what you can do to tailor the assignments to your students. In some cases, I know that not all cases are going to be this way, but a personalized learning experience, especially for a small campus like ours, is great to make sure your students are engaged, and it also helps with retention, because if a student knows that you're going to work with them and help them to learn, and they really want to actively learn, it's going to be key in their success. I'm not saying give students extensions beyond deadlines if you don't need to, or things like that, but there are cases where students really want to learn, and they just need that little bit of extra help or personalization so that they can accomplish that. And then organize for optimal effectiveness. This is key for both face-to-face and online. I know when we hear organization of course, a lot of people go to online and say, oh, well, my course just has to be organized and Blackboard has to be organized so they know. But with face-to-face course, organization is just as important. You have to have your lesson plan ready. You have to make sure you have that knowledge ready, because every day you come into that classroom, you have to be on your A game, because those students are there to learn, and they want to learn from you because you're the expert. So being organized and prepared is vital for that. So these are some of our references, the fun stuff. Any questions? Great. I'm done.